So for an agenda today, like I said, we'll talk about a little bit broadly what governance is and what it entails. We'll educate you on some of the options that Microsoft 365 provides out of the box. So things that you can do if you've got an E3 license. Some of the things we'll talk about will require some of the other licenses like E5 or P1 and P2, but all of this is going to be out of the box. We're not going to cover any third-party tools. We're not really going to cover any custom coding. And then we'll talk through some scenarios. And the reason that I like to do that is we'll take the lens of 3 different companies. One company that's going to be very, very tightly locked down, another company that's going to be a little bit more balanced, and then a third company that's going to be very, very open, and talk about some of the specific governance scenarios you might want to implement and how they can be implemented in those 3 companies. Because the nice thing with the Microsoft toolset is that you do have a lot of flexibility as well. Not everything is going to work for every organization, but there is a whole range of options that you can apply. So what happens if we don't do this? Now, this is a typical client that comes to us and we do something called an audit of their Microsoft Teams environment. This is generally what we're starting to see. Now, I'm not sure what it's like within your organization. Some of them are much easier or much better. Some of them are a little bit worse, but this is actually real data. So we had a client come to us last year, 12,000 person organization. They never really launched Teams. It just kind of happened. So that was kind of really typical. Of course, they have the out of the box capability. So anyone can create teams, groups, and SharePoint sites. So once again, this is something we'll talk about how we can stop also. In January 2021, they had a couple of thousand teams. By April, they had 3,000. They're experiencing roughly about 40% growth in 2.5 months. And when we looked at out of those 3,000 teams, what was going on, it didn't look particularly good. And this is actually one of the better customers that we've seen, because we've seen some pretty nasty kind of things happen. So out of those 3,000 teams, 2,300 of them only had the general channel, right? That really means that people weren't really using the full power of Teams. They didn't know that you can add additional channels. I think the same amount didn't actually know you could add additional tabs. We see across our customers as well, lots and lots of teams and groups which people just start and then abandon. And these typically have the word test, testing, TST, demo, temp, or someone's name in them. Lots of teams that only have 1 or maybe less than 1 member, lots of ownerless teams. We're also seeing a pretty huge trend as well that a lot of organizations are under the impression that they don't use private channels. Turns out they do. And there's always a few teams in every organization that have like a huge amount of channels involved. It's a trend that we've been seeing a lot of our customers. You have like a team and you have like 200 channels. A lot of them will be private channels also. So once again, this is kind of the sort of thing that can happen with no real good governance in place. And of course, you can control this with Microsoft 365, but a lot of organizations don't. And like I said, this is kind of typical from what we're seeing. We're definitely seeing a huge proliferation of teams. We're definitely seeing a lot of duplication, a lot of sprawl with organizations. And the reason for that is as the rush to remote works happened, we really needed just to get these things spun up and keep people working. But now that, COVID's starting to die down, we're starting maybe to get to some sort of normal, a lot of organizations are coming back now and trying to determine what they can do. Now, you probably know if you have an ineffective Microsoft Teams implementation, if you do have some of these symptoms. So Teams duplication is a really common issue that we see with a lot of organizations. Now, the reason for that is someone goes in, they create a team called Project Alpha, they make that team private, someone else goes in and creates a team called Project Alpha as well. Microsoft Teams is going to let you do that. They have 2 teams called Project Alpha. Each of those are private. They don't know that they exist. These people work on these separate teams for a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, and they come back to IT and say, oh, shoot, we've got 2 teams. Can you now merge them together? And that's not really easy to do. Ineffective and inconsistent naming is another huge challenge for a lot of organizations. We'll talk about some of the out-of-the-box naming capabilities that you can use. But people name teams really badly, the same way that they name files really badly. And like I said, out of the box, there's no real good way to enforce that unless you apply manual governance policies. Lack of ownership is another huge challenge, particularly with users creating teams, being the only owner, and then leaving that organization. And then you have this concept of like an ownerless team, lots of issues that come as part of that. No one really knows who owns the content, so it's really difficult for anyone to make a decision around that content. But the other thing, of course, is that the team members, they can't go and get things done that they need to, so they typically turn back to IT. And lots of other things that we see here. The other one that we really are seeing at the moment is kind of Teams features not being utilized effectively. So lots of teams with maybe only a single channel, lots of teams where people aren't using the tab capabilities of Microsoft Teams, which is really, really powerful. But lots of organizations is using Teams essentially as, you know, a single chat, kind of a single conversation window through the general channel, and then using it as a file share, really missing out on some of those capabilities that Teams could offer. And there's some really simple things that you can do. Adding a couple of additional channels, maybe adding a couple of tabs, using some of the capabilities within SharePoint in terms of maybe something like posting news or having links there. Like we see, a lot of organizations just miss those pieces also. And if you want to know more about these ineffective team symptoms, just let me know. We actually have a few pieces of collateral around that. Okay, so let's talk about at a high level, kind of what governance is in Microsoft Teams. So this is more from the strategic level. Really, a lot of the governance decisions you're going to have to come up with around Microsoft Teams and Microsoft 365 have to be driven by something. And it's really driven by some of these strategic decisions that you make as an organization. The way that we like to think about governance is to help governance drive adoption, right? I think there needs to be a balance there. A lot of organizations we find flail between these two extremes. Either everything is really open and anyone can create anything, which is the out-of-the-box kind of approach that you get with Microsoft 365, or we're going to lock everything down and everything has to go through an approval process and it can be slow and can be cumbersome. You know, we feel there's a middle ground there, and I think everyone feels that. It's just getting to that middle ground can be a little bit different. So from the governance side, like I said, your goal should be dynamic and frictionless self-service for your users and robust management. Typically, organizations start off with a governance plan before defining these options and what they're going to implement. Typical governance plan, you want to define some roles for different aspects. So IT, end user, some of the more technical roles, some of the particular roles you're going to have around teams in particular. So team owners, team members, and guests. You want to define the responsibility, so what each role is responsible for. For instance, the team owner could be responsible for requesting teams and making sure correct owners are assigned. You also want to have some processes around that and understand the processes, particularly around creation, archiving, and deletion of teams before you get started. Access and ownership is another huge one. And the last one is really around policies for managing content. So things like taxonomy, labeling, and everything else. And the reason that you do this and what governance can help you achieve is a number of things. So even though governance is traditionally viewed very much from a compliance sort of aspect, so helping your organization stay compliant, with social rules, culture rules, SOX, GDPR, whatever that is. Really what you want to look at is some of the other things. We really see governance as a great way to drive user adoption within an organization. We think there can be a balance there, and we'll talk about that. But also, like I said, helping you manage sprawl. So team sprawl at the moment, I think, is probably the largest or the biggest challenge that we see in organizations. Information leaks is another huge one, particularly with things like external sharing and guest access. You want to have some governance policies around that. The other way that I like to look at it is you can also simplify that end user experience, right? There's a number of capabilities you can disable within Microsoft Teams and Microsoft 365, which are more kind of governance techniques or more kind of governance options that you can use, but you can actually control some of the things that people can do within Teams, right? So you can kind of simplify that end user experience for your organization if there's things that you don't really or never use. And personally, I think the reason that it's such a challenge is that there's no real right answer, right? There's no right answer for every organization from a governance perspective. There probably is going to be a right answer for your organization also. So either you might have a very limited control sort of mechanism. So like I said, everything is open, everything is self-service. You've got no governance policies in place. That's one extreme. The other extreme is where everything is very, very tightly locked down. And we do see in a lot of organizations where literally everything is locked down, right? So the creation of teams, the ability to add guests, all the way to the point where in some organizations, users or end users can't even be owners of these teams. They can only be members, and anything they want to do as a member, they have to go get approval from IT. So if they want to create a new channel or they want to add a new tab, for instance, that has to go through a bit of a formalized process. So like I said, where you fit is going to depend on your organization, where you are and what you need. But the nice thing is there's a lot of leeway, and we'll talk about a lot of these options here. Okay, so now that we understand things from a bit of a high level, how is governance actually implemented? What are some of the options? What are some of the knobs, the switches, the capabilities that you can use? And it turns out there is a ton there. There's an incredible amount of capabilities that you can turn on and turn off straight out of the box. No PowerShell needed. This is all basically done through the Teams Admin Center, the Groups Admin Center, or through the security and compliance area within Microsoft Teams. Now, broadly, there's kind of three main ways essentially that this works. So there's three types of settings which are applied, which kind of bring together this kind of thing of teams governance. The settings can either be applied at an individual team or an individual teams level, or the teams environment at itself. It can be defined at the group level. It can also be deployed in the security and compliance center within Microsoft 365 for things like retention, DLP, and a few other pieces there. The nice thing around all of these settings, or the majority of them, is they can either be applied at a global level, so to everyone within your organization, or you can also apply them to users or user-specific groups, which means that you can have a default setting. And in addition to that, you can have overrides, which help you kind of even more granularly control these pieces. So you had a lot of leeway there in terms of maybe have a global setting for a group of users for some of these particular options, and then being able to apply these settings on a user-by-user basis, or even in some cases an Azure AD basis through here also. And there is a ton of governance controls within Teams. There is a lot here. I think it's once again one of the reasons that people really don't know where to start. But there's a ton here. Everything from controlling the types of Teams apps that people can have access to through something like app permission policies. Of course, using app setup policies. If you didn't know, you can also pin Teams apps automatically to users within your organization. This has become incredibly popular with things like Viva now, where you can automatically set up a policy within your organization to have maybe your Viva intranet pinned on your Teams environment for your users. Lots of settings and options around meetings also. So what people can do within meetings, what guests can do, what they can share, what they can't share. Lots of settings around channels. So what can people do in channel conversations, around chat, external access, group classification? There's just a ton of options that you can implement straight out of the box through here. But where should you start? So this is where we recommend organizations should start. These are kind of the main, I think, 5 or 7 things. If you want to get started from a governance perspective, these are some of the questions that you should be asking. The first one is really around creation, because creation is typically where things really start to go terribly wrong for people. So kind of understanding who are you going to enable to allow to create teams, SharePoint sites, groups, right? We'll talk about how to implement in this in just a moment. But controlling creation can be a good first step to help you control things like sprawl, duplication of content, and also guiding your users and helping them understand exactly what Teams can do for them. The next one is around naming conventions. So like you said, controlling the name of Teams, having things like prefixes and suffixes and naming policies can be really useful. The other thing you can define is the concept of blocked words. So there might not be specific words or acronyms that you want people to use within your team names. You can also define all of those. The third question is also around guest access. So for a lot of organizations, that ability to invite guests or external users into your organization is extremely powerful. But once again, you want to make sure that you manage that. Now, out of the box, particularly with some of the lower license tiers that Microsoft 365 provides, like E3, some of this is a little bit limited. With some of the higher license SKUs like E5, you've got some additional capabilities through here, but you've got more options than just allowing guests or not. Overall, you can control this maybe on a team-by-team basis. For instance, you can also control some of the external sharing options for content through here. And then expiry is another huge one. The proliferation of groups and teams as people create these things and then they stop using them after a period of time can really be challenging. So we'll talk about expiry. Next, after those main four, talking about policies as well. So retention, e-discovery, DLP. For some organizations, this can be the first step. For other organizations, this can be a little bit later on, but really understanding, do you have retention needs, especially if you're allowing external sharing, things like DLP policies. And probably the last one I'll just touch upon here before I move on is really the use of templates. So I think this idea of just, giving users a blank team and expecting them to work it out themselves doesn't drive nearly the adoption of Microsoft Teams as giving them a really simple template, right? So here's how we do a project. Here's how we respond to an RFP. Here's what a department team might look like. And once again, there's a lot of capabilities that Microsoft has introduced, particularly in the last year around Teams templates. They're fairly limited, but at least it's a start. There's also some SharePoint templates coming as well. There's some new mechanisms around that, and of course you can use themes. But there's a lot here. There's a lot that you can get started. Well, like I said, what I would recommend is just start on those kind of main, four. So who can create stuff, naming conventions, guests if you're using those, and expiry as well. Okay, so now that we kind of understand some of these options, how do we implement these? So this is the part where we pretend we are going to be 3 different companies for 3 different needs. So how we're going to do this is we're going to have 3 different companies, and we're going to talk about each one of these options in the lens of these 3 different organizations, just to give you an idea in terms of how flexible some of these governance policies can be. So we've got 3 different organizations that we're going to work with here. So the first one is called Lockdown Corp. So Lockdown Corp, they work in a very heavily regulated industry. Lockdown Corp, for every single one of these governance scenarios, they're going to try to lock everything down as much as they can. The next one is Balanced Industries. So Balanced Industries is kind of where you want to be. You want to strike that balance between IT control and user adoption. So for every governance scenario we're going to go through, Balanced Industries is going to make that kind of balanced approach. And then we have Startup Inc. So Startup Inc., they're fast, they're growing, they got like $50 billion in venture capital funding. They have baristas in their office. Everyone gets a beanbag. So what they're going to do is essentially just be as open as possible. Now, a bit of a quick tip for you. By default, in Microsoft 365, if you do not change any of the governance policies, you are functioning effectively as Startup Inc., okay? By default, everything is very open within Microsoft Teams. Users can create anything. Guest access typically is going to be enabled. It doesn't have to be that's changed, I know, but it is. But what I find is a lot of organizations, they think that they're Lockdown Corp, and they might be as an organization, but their Teams environment is functioning as Startup Inc. because they haven't gone and looked and changed at any of these options. So it's something to think about here. Okay, so let's talk about the first one, which is around Teams creation. So really the first step, the decision point that we have here is who's going to be able to create groups and teams within your organization, right? So pretty simple things. Some of the considerations that you want to think about this. So limiting who can create teams and how they do it can, of course, aid in controlling sprawl and kind of having a consistent structure. But it's going to come at the cost of self-service and additional load. So someone's going to have to do this. If you're going to lock everything down, there has to be another process that you're going to allow your users to go through to do this. If you are going to lock this down, like I said, you need to create some sort of process. There's tons of tools out there now that can help you. You can write your own flow. You can write your own Power App. Microsoft has a free tool called Requester App, which is really good. There's obviously third-party tools as well as part of this. But like I said, if you're not going to allow people to create groups and create teams, there has to be a way for them to at least to request, and then someone has to create it for them. And we see in a lot of organizations that we work with that someone or something is usually a person or maybe a PowerShell script or something along those lines. Now, if we look at this teams creation piece from our 3 fictitious companies here, we can see how much flexibility you have. So Lockdown Corp, they're going to lock everything down, right? So Lockdown Corp is going to disable the creation of teams through the native UI, and they're going to use the tool to control the request and approval of teams. So they've gone in, they've stopped users from creating groups. That means they can't create teams. They also can't create team sites either, or planner plans or any of those things. And everything has to go through an official process. Balanced Industries takes a little bit of a different approach, and this is an approach that I like, and I hope to see more organizations using. So balanced approach is going to say not everyone can create teams, but what we're going to do is if you go through some training, maybe you sit down for 30 minutes, for example, we'll show you what Teams is, we'll talk to you about some governance policies, and once you've gone through that, then you can go and create your own teams, and we're going to enable that self-service capability just for a subset of users within your organization. So once again, this could be a really good balanced approach, right? Before people go ham and start creating all of this stuff, maybe they go through, it can be really short, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Here's what Teams is, here's some governance policies, here's how you should name them, and take it from there. Startup Industries is just happy having users use the actual tools. So like I said, they're going to let everyone create anything. And of course, that's the out-of-the-box option with Microsoft 365. So like I said, if you haven't changed any of these, you're going to be functioning as Startup Inc. Let's talk about the next one. So this is a really interesting one as well. This concept of default and available apps, so available Teams apps within your environment. So as you know, out of the box, as a user, I can go and add any of the, I think there's like 1,100 apps now within Microsoft Teams if you don't lock any of that stuff down. The nice thing is, once again, there's a lot of capabilities that you can use out of the box. So there's really 2 things we're looking at here. A is which apps do we want to give our users access to? And the other one is which apps or Teams apps do we want to default for our users? So if you didn't know this, you can pin apps for users in the right-hand in the right-hand rail that it's called there. So a couple of things that you can basically do here. You can control what Teams apps users can add from the App Store. These can be different per groups of organizations. The other thing that you can also do is, like I said, pin these particular apps to particular groups of users. So different groups can actually have different apps that are pinned for them, which can be a really great way to drive adoption. So maybe the marketing people have something like, the Adobe Creative Cloud through there, well as someone from IT, maybe one of their apps they have is Jira or DevOps or something like that. The way that you implement this within Teams is actually 3 different things. So it's what's called an application setup policy, an app permission policy, and an org-wide app setting. Okay, so Lockdown Corp. So Lockdown Corp is going to basically remove access to pretty much everything, right? So no third-party apps. They're not going to allow users to add any personal apps. They're not going to allow users to pin apps either. Essentially, Lockdown Corp with these 3 settings is going to say you can't add any third-party apps. You can't add any custom apps, and the apps on the left-hand side that you use, they're the only ones that you're going to essentially do. Now, this might sound good in theory. The problem that you might find if you're going down this direction, particularly if you're using Viva at the moment, is if you block custom apps, users aren't going to be able to add the Viva Connections intranet app to them, right? But there's other options that you can go through, get good to go through here. This is a pretty extreme approach through here, but once again, it gives you some of it hopefully gives you an example of how much leeway you have in here. So you don't want users to add any third-party apps, any custom apps, or any Microsoft apps. Now, when I say Microsoft apps, they still have the ability to use the native stuff like Word and PowerPoint and all of those pieces. It's other apps from Microsoft essentially. So it's not those out-of-the-box apps. If you block Microsoft apps, they can still add like the SharePoint app, for instance, but it's some of the other apps that Microsoft provides that they won't be able to do. Balance Industries is a little bit more sensible. So they want their users to add some third-party apps. So they want to give users the ability to add some of the third-party apps in Microsoft 365 in the Team Store, but not all of them. They also have a third-party solution they want to use. Maybe they want to roll out Beaver. So they're going to make that a default. So in their org-wide settings, they're going to allow third-party apps for users. They're also going to allow custom apps. One of the interesting options here as well is under third-party apps. Let me highlight this here for you. Under third-party apps is this one. So as you know, there's new apps being published to the Teams App Store literally every single day. But the nice thing is there's an option there to say, well, we're only going to allow the third-party apps from this moment in time. Anything post we're going to block, so you can actually review any of those new apps that appear. It can be good in theory. It can also be really cumbersome because there's so many of those new apps available there, but you can do that. From an application permission policy, they're going to allow the Microsoft apps. They're going to allow a specific set of third-party apps, but not all of them. So this is a great way for you in an organization if you want to control what apps people can actually choose from the Teams App Store. So they're going to allow the Adobe Creative Cloud, Jira Cloud, and Stack Overflow for Teams. And they also have a custom app that they're going to use. In this case, it's Orchestra, but probably for you, it's going to be something like Viva, right? That's really the first app that we see organizations deploying, which is custom for everyone. And for their app setup policy, they're going to essentially pin those custom apps for their users. So when a user logs on to Teams, they have that third-party app pinned there, ready to go for them. So this is a great way, particularly from an intranet perspective, where you can go and actually have your intranet app pinned on everyone's Teams left-hand rail. But once again, you can get quite granular with this. So you can set up an application setup policy for a group of users, let's say marketing, and pin the Adobe Creative Cloud and the intranet for marketing. Whereas maybe for folks in IT, you set up another application setup policy where there what you're going to have is Jira Cloud and Stack Overflow for Teams, and maybe Azure DevOps as well. So you do have a lot of flexibility through there. And then the final thing is Startup Inc. Now, once again, Startup Inc. is going to make all of these apps available. And these are the out-of-the-box settings. So like I've said a couple of times here, if you haven't changed any of these options, you are basically Startup Inc., right? So by default, I can add any custom apps, any third-party apps, and any Microsoft apps within my Teams environment if you haven't changed any of these settings. And it's quite surprising of how many people don't actually change any of these. All right, let's talk about the next one here. We'll talk about group naming policies. So naming policy is pretty simple, is you want to enforce kind of naming conventions on how teams and groups are named. And as you know, naming can have a huge impact on being able to find teams and organize all of this content through there. Now, out of the box, there's a capability within Microsoft 365 to apply naming at the group basis. In my mind, it's not particularly useful because you typically want a little bit more granularity than that, right? You probably want naming based on a particular type of template or a particular type of use case also. But out of the box, you have the ability with Azure AD P1 to have things like prefixes and suffixes. You also have the ability of when a user goes and creates a group or a team, that you can pull out attributes from that user and use that as part of the name. So for instance, maybe you want to prefix the team with the company that the user works for or for the department. If they have that within their Active Directory profile and you have this set up, when a user goes and creates the team, you can actually prefix that particular piece in there. In terms of naming conventions, I think everyone really overthinks this. This can be pretty simple, right? It doesn't have to be really complicated through here. So some really typical examples: project teams and sites, right? Typically a prefix of PRJ, PROJ, dash maybe the project ID and what we call the descriptive name, so the name of the team. If you've got departments, for instance, DEPT, and then a bit of a classification, and then the actual department name. We see a lot of organizations, they really want their end users to know if guest or external access is also defined. So maybe putting EXT or guest in front of the name of that team or that group can be really useful. If you're a multinational, having the geography, maybe the business unit and the descriptive name can be super useful as well. So on the left-hand side here, these are some pretty kind of actually pretty well-named teams, right? We don't have a bunch of kind of crazy team names through here, but applying some of these naming conventions, you can see, just makes things a little bit easier. One warning though, don't go crazy with the prefixes, because the more prefixes you have, the less room you actually have for the team name. And you'll notice that in teams that things start to disappear here pretty often. So we see with a lot of organizations, they'll have like 4 prefixes and people don't actually know what it is. They can't actually see it within the team's rail. So the other option around that is either make it a suffix or just keep those prefixes fairly short. So when people go and scroll through the teams on the left-hand side, they can actually see all of those team names there as well. And just one more thing before we jump into some questions here is team owners and member settings. So lots of flexibility here, particularly in terms of what you want to allow your team members to be able to do through here. So the decision point around this is really how much power do you want your members to have in teams for things like managing channels, adding and remove tabs, and editing their messages, for example. We find with a lot of organizations, some of them are fine letting team members do anything, but a lot of them really want to go down the approach where you have an owner for a team, which is essentially responsible for the team. Think of it as a steward, and all members are allowed to do is essentially work within the context of that particular team. So you can go and you can create some rules around that. So what could this look like? So Lockdown CoOp, surprisingly enough, is going to lock everything down for their members. Essentially, as a member, the only thing you can really do here is go create some messages. You can't actually edit your messages, so you got to be careful about that. And you can go and upload documents, and that's pretty much it. You can't add custom apps, you can't add channels, you can't add tabs, you can't do any of those pieces. So in that case, like I said, if they want to do anything, if a member wants to add an additional channel, an additional tab, any of those pieces, they have to go through here. So this is a pretty extreme approach. We don't see this very often, but we do see it sometimes here as well. The next one is around balance industries. So balance industries, what they're going to do is go down a little bit of a different approach. So they don't want their members to go and, let's say, add new channels or apps. So they're going to remove the ability to do that, but they're fine with their members adding things like tabs or connectors, and also, deleting and editing their message. So in this case, think of it as the team owner essentially defines the structure of that team in terms of the channels. And what you're going to allow to do is your members to be able to work within the context of those teams. Maybe they can add tabs to existing channels and add some connectors. But once again, if they want to add things like apps or delete and restore channels, for instance, they have to go through those team owners. This can be a really good approach, particularly for new organizations within teams, because we do see a lot of times that in some organizations, members don't know what they're doing. They start deleting channels, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And then the final thing is around Startup Inc. So what does Startup Inc. allow you to do? Well, Startup Inc. basically is going to do what Out of the Box does. So out of the box, like I said, members can go and do anything, right? So they can go and update channels, they can create private channels if you do have that ability enabled. They can delete channels, add or remove app, and do all of that sort of stuff as well. So like I said, for some organizations, this is going to work really, really well, kind of really empowering your members through there. But for other organizations, you might want to go down more of a balanced industries approach. And of course, these can be different on each individual team, right? So you can actually set up these configuration options on a team by team basis. So maybe for some teams, you go down the approach of Startup Inc., but maybe on other teams, you go down the approach of something like balanced industries, right? Where you have a little bit more control through there as well. And of course, there's other things you might want to look at as well. Channel moderation, again, is a really, really good idea to look at, particularly for the general channel through here. So I know we are almost out of time, so let's talk about some
about 2 minutes left, Michael. About 2 minutes. That's including questions.
All right, I will jump over here and I'll jump over to questions. So just a couple of takeaways. I know we blasted through this, but hopefully, like I said, there's a lot of these out-of-the-box governance options that you can use, right? So in terms of looking at these pieces, start small. Look at those 4 main things that we kind of talked about. So the ability who can create teams, guest access, The life cycle around teams also can be really useful. What I would say is don't just roll out teams with the out-of-the-box settings, right? You've got a lot of leeway there to go and change these options. It's all out of the box. It can all be done through the Teams Admin Center. These are all settings and policies that you can easily change. And the nice thing is if you change something, you can always change it back, right? So you can really define these pieces to make sure that they're going to provide your organization value. Awesome. Well, that's all for me here. Let me turn it over to the crowd if you have any questions.
So please, if you have any questions, raise your hand. Also, anybody attending the online, raise your hand as well, and we can unmute you. So any questions? Oh, here we go. Just a sec.
Hi, that's good. Hi, Michael. Good to see you again. I was just wondering, you had the prefix of like department and project on there. We've had some clients that kind of find it frustrating to kind of have to type that and then the name and kind of look for a suffix as well. Just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Typically we try to standardize on those pieces, but it really depends. Like a lot of organizations, what we're finding is they want to have the ability to generate like a unique product, unique project ID, for instance. So we do see some third-party tools doing that, where the prefix could be PRJ-001, 007, and those sorts of pieces. The other option, which is really common, is instead of having users type those things in, is use something like metadata, for example. So they're actually choosing from a series of options, and those options are being put into that naming policy. Unfortunately, once again, you're looking at some custom code, either third-party solutions or something like a Power App to do that.
Thank you.
Excellent. Unfortunately, we are at time, so big round of applause for Michael in the presentation here.